When I was 14, I was invited over to a birthday sleepover at my friend Harmony's house. This was back in the late 90s when sleepovers were a really big deal, and a lot of planning went into it, because you couldn't rely on cell phones and internet to keep your guests entertained. There were only 3 of us, myself, Harmony, and our other friend Olive. Harmony had just turned 15, so naturally there was a party with several members of her family in attendance. We all played in the pool, threw horseshoes, and had a dessert making contest with a load of different baked and sweet goods for us to combine and enjoy. We watched Back to the Future on VHS as the family started to trickle out, and we set up our sleeping bags on the floor. Harmony shared a room with her older sister, so the 3 of us would be sleeping in the much more spacious living room. That way we could watch movies late into night. Harmony lived in an old mid-century single-story house from the 1960s, and at the far end of the living room, there was a short drop of about 3 steps into a den. I set up my sleeping bag over near the stairs, with my toes hanging over the top step. We started watching Black Beauty. It was just the 3 of us in the living room at that point. Harmony was the closest to the TV. Olive was by the couch and I was still near the steps. For some reason I kept glancing over my shoulder and peering into the darkness of the room behind me. I felt uneasy, kind of paranoid, like we had to be careful not to disturb anyone who might be in that room, even though I knew it was empty. I asked Harmony if we could turn on the light in there, so I could just relax and plainly see that there was no one there. She declined, not wanting to get up out of her sleeping bag, and I didn't know where the light switches were. Harmony fell asleep first, and when the movie ended, Olive and I just sat in the dark whispering back and forth, because I thought I heard a noise from the den behind me, like the dull tap someone makes when they set down a coffee mug. I asked Olive if she heard anything. She always said she didn't, though to be fair, she was deaf in one ear. I didn't want to come across as a baby and move across the room, stepping over both girls in the process, so I made myself stop paying attention and drifted off to sleep. I woke up twice, both times to pull my sleeping bag tighter around my chin, because for some reason, it seemed to be slipping out from underneath me and down the stairs. The 3rd time I woke up was because I clearly heard the sound of a book falling off the shelf in the den behind me. Not a small book either. It was a big textbook. I looked over my shoulder. The first light of day was starting to peek through the windows, and I didn't see anything other than the book on the floor. When I laid my head back down on the pillow, that's when it happened. My sleeping bag was firmly, almost violently tugged, and I slid across the floor with it. I tumbled fully down the stairs, smacking my chin on each step. It happened very fast, but I remember clearly that my legs never touched the stairs. It was only my upper body that made contact with the carpeted steps, because I was physically being pulled down them, and my legs were in the air. I freaked out and raised 7 different types of hell. I kicked off my sleeping bag and sprinted up the stairs and clear into the bathroom on the far side of the house, where I locked myself in and cried. Harmony and her family assumed that I had a nightmare, but then when I told them that I was pulled down the steps, they tried to reassure me that I had just fallen in my sleep. I knew the truth though. I had a rug burn on my chin to prove it. Had I been asleep, I would have maybe slid down the stairs, very slowly. When they made sure that I wasn't hurt, Harmony's dad retrieved my sleeping bag, and we all had a very early breakfast. I went home still shaken, and for a few days I had to sleep with my bathroom light on. It wasn't until a few years later, when I was getting ready to graduate from high school, that Harmony told me that her parents knew there was paranormal activity in that far room, but chose not to tell us. I never told her, but every so often in my nightmares, I am pulled down those steps again, and in the dream, I always see the same pale face. It's the face of a toothless old woman. She is silently screaming at me, with furious eyes, as she drags me towards her. Back in the late 70s, when I was about 11, I was invited over my cousin's place for a sleepover in the family's new trailer. It was a smaller one that only had 2 wheels and had to be hitched behind a truck. It had a dining room area that could be adjusted. and the cushioned benches could be pulled out and used as twin beds. The cousin whose family owned the trailer was older, about 16, and our other cousin was about 15. The trailer was hitched to my uncle's truck and parked in their barn. It should be noted that they live in a heavily wooded area in Montana. After dinner, we headed into the trailer. We played some card games, and they snuck some beer from the fridge in the garage. They wouldn't let me try any. I fell asleep around 1 in the morning. At daybreak, I was awoken to the trailer in motion. I sat upright, looked out the window to see the world passing by around me as the trailer was pulled down the bumpy road. I tried waking up my cousins, but they were both dead asleep. The truck kept moving for another 10 minutes or so, and then it parked out by a clearing in the trees. I heard the truck door open and shut. There was a few moments of silence before there came a loud gunshot and a stream of angry cursing. Then there was the sound of someone walking into the woods. The gunshot still hadn't woken my cousins, so I peeked out of the windows and remained quiet for about half an hour until they both woke up. They were both severely hungover and were extremely pissed to find that the trailer had been transported miles away from the house. I told them what I knew, which wasn't much, and we put on our shoes and started walking back towards home. It was about 40 degrees out that morning, and none of us had any jackets. To make matters worse, in the distance we could see wolves stalking us through the trees, which freaked me out big time, and I kept stopping to point them out. My cousins told me not to look at them, but to ignore them and keep walking. After another hour or so, the wolves closed ranks and were keeping pace with us, with one of them walking openly behind us, about 40 yards behind. I was positive that we were all going to die, but my cousins continued to tell me to ignore them and keep walking forward. It took us 4 hours to get back to the house. The wolves stopped following us before we got to the driveway. They could probably smell the dogs pinned up by the house. We stomped into the kitchen, cold, exhausted, hungry, and furious, but otherwise unharmed. They hadn't even realized that the truck and trailer were missing. It turns out my uncle's friend had gotten super drunk, driven over to the barn, hot-wired the truck, and drove it into the woods to go hunting, without seeming to notice or care that the trailer was attached. He eventually returned to the house, and my family had him arrested. To this day, I still remember the feeling of trying to ignore the biting cold, and the sensation of eyes on my back, as the wolves followed us, contemplating us as food. In retrospect, we probably should have tried making ourselves look bigger or something, and scare them away, rather than turn our backs on them. But regardless, I'm amazed at how calm we managed to keep ourselves in that situation. This isn't my story, but my mother's. When she was about 17 or 18, she and a few of her friends went out to have a party at a lake house. This was late August in Canada, so the nights could still get uncomfortably cold. And they built a fire inside the fireplace, and another bonfire outside in the backyard. It was at this party where my mother would meet her eventual sister-in-law, who would eventually introduce her to my dad. The party started at lunch, and apparently kept going till well after dark. By that point, most of the group had gone home, but my mom, my future aunt, and 3 other people still huddled around the bonfire at midnight. They were too drunk to drive, so they decided to make it a sleepover and take off in the morning. Technically, they weren't supposed to be spending the night there. The property belonged to a friend of a friend, who had only given their consent to use the place during the day. My mom said she passed out on the couch for a few hours, but then was abruptly awoken by the sound of loud tapping on the window above her head, and to the smell of something burning. She ignored it, thinking it was nothing, but after a few minutes, there was another short succession of tapping on the window. She sat up quickly and made eye contact with a bearded man, standing directly outside the window, staring at her with blank, emotionless eyes. She freaked and leapt up off the couch and stumbled into one of the bedrooms, where she shook her friend awake. When he finally sat up, he was alarmed at the smell of something burning, and he barely paid attention to what my mom was saying. She followed him into the second bedroom, where their other friend, who was in bed with my aunt, had apparently fallen asleep with a lit cigarette in his hand, and his shirt was on fire on the floor where he had dropped it. Everyone started screaming, causing the smoker and my aunt to wake up, and stupidly, the first thing they tried to do was put out the fire by emptying a half a bottle of vodka on it. Keep in mind that they were just dumb teenagers. The fire caught the curtains, and almost immediately after it caught the bedspread. My mom had closed the bedroom door behind them when they entered, still terrified of the strange figure outside. When the fire started spreading, she flung open the door to see the bearded man standing outside the sliding glass window and was peering in at them. My mom says in that moment, she was as scared as she had ever been in her life. Caught between wanting to flee from the house because of the fire and wanting to remain in the house because of the figure outside. She said without pausing to think, she flung open the window on the opposite wall where the fire had not spread yet, and jumped outside and ran for the road, without bothering to check if the other three were behind her. The fifth partygoer had decided to sleep in his own car, so my mom pounded against his windshield until he woke up and unlocked his doors. And within the next minute, all five of them piled into the car and sped off, my mom freaking out about the strange man, who she was convinced was there to kill them. It all happened so fast, she was almost unable to process all of it as it was happening. My mom claims from the time she awoke to the time they drove off was probably less than 5 minutes. No one else in her group ever saw the man. They essentially abandoned the house to burn, with a whole pile of dry wood still stacked inside by the fireplace. And by the time the fire department got there wasn't much left to save. No one reported ever seeing a bearded man on the property, and the owners claimed that they had no idea who he was. The real kicker came a few weeks later, when the husk of the house was being demolished. A body was discovered buried beneath the back porch. The police estimated it had been there for well over a year. My mom is in her 50s. She still has constant nightmares about that strange man that was outside the window.
There's always a reason to be afraid.